Without any further ado, let's introduce today's book. So this is Distant Sunflower Fields. Why don't you pop in the chat how many people have read this? We got lots of readers today. I also am very guilty of coming to book clubs where I haven't read the book. So very much welcome to anyone who hasn't read the book as well. I hope that this inspires you to go read it. So this is a book by Juan and translated by Christopher Payne. And it is the story of three women surviving and thriving, question mark, in the fields and the Xinjiang province. So Christopher is the translator. He's translated many other books as well, and he currently works at the University of Toronto as the, what is it, associate professor in the Chinese coordinating.
Just some guy who teaches translation, that's all.
So welcome. Thank you so much for joining me again tonight.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. And thanks for everybody for coming along.
So I thought we'd start with a question that to me was a really unique part of this book straight away, and maybe something that I feel I have less read outside of translation, and actually maybe less read outside of Juan. Like, I think it's just very much her stylistic, is this circularity, like almost the same sentences. I was like, I think I read that sentence some time before. So how was it? And what do you think the purpose of the circularity and other certain stylistic features, like, dare I say, the ellipses, and what do you think that sort of, how was that for you? What was your intent behind translating the circularity? And is it as Juan wrote it, or did you alter it in any way?
It's interesting. I looked at some of these questions beforehand, so I've had an inkling of what to say about these. But yeah, no, you're right. And this is Juan's style is different from what I'm used to reading and working on in Chinese fiction as well. So when I was first actually asked to translate this book, I didn't know what to expect. And then when I started getting into it, I was like, this is really different, I guess is the best way to describe it. And I guess that sums up how people have often talked about her, is that she's kind of she's an insider outsider, is how I've described her in different areas, and insofar as that she doesn't conform to the standards of what's expected of Chinese literature, or it's certainly what's expected of it in translation. And she has a uniqueness to how she puts things together. And the question of circularity, I think I was asked how to define this as a genre, and I referred to it as creative nonfiction, which almost seems an oxymoron because, it's nonfiction. So how is it creative if we think of creative as being fiction? But I think it's the journey that she takes herself on, this mental landscape into these memories of her life lived in this very remote part of China. And like memories in general, they don't happen in linear fashion, right? We think of things and then we forget about them, and then we remember them again, and then it pops up again. And there was definitely that feeling of circularity that comes back and forth at reading through. And when I was reading through the text in the initial sense before translating it, I had the same feeling. I was like, I've read this sentence before. Wait a minute, we're back where we began. And it's that process of her just simply kind of diving into these memories that she has of this very kind of particular style of life that she experienced whilst in this very remote area. It was funny because I talked about Distant Sunflower Fields with another group a little while ago, and to kind of situate them geographically, I had all these maps, and putting this in mind, it is really, really remote, the area that she's in. It's unbelievably remote. And I mean, the big story nowadays is with the Belt and Road Initiative. And even, that goes through Urumqi and so on, or ostensibly that's where it's going to go through. And yet where she lived is even more remote from that. And it's kind of stuck up in this little corner of the top bit of Xinjiang. It's almost like a triangle. And then you've got the mountains that are there, and of course Kazakhstan, because of course most of her the groups that she encounters are Kazakhs, and so Kazakhstan kind of looms large above it, and so on. And it's this, yeah, I found it was really fascinating that you were being drawn into her recollections of the area. And I like stories like that in any case. I like circularity in stories. I remember years ago in my undergraduate days reading Rashomon by Akutagawa. And of course, telling the story from different perspectives. And you're reading things all again and again and again. And it's that memory of events. And so that's what I tried to bring out into the book. Its sentences read very kind of very much the same. Yeah, I mean, that's the case in the original. I probably tried to alter things to some extent because I've, synonyms and thesauruses are next to me all the time type of thing. But it's, yeah, I guess it draws you in, and that purposeful destabilization of linearity, of linear storytelling, is what I think kind of draws the reader in and captures the imagination. And you kind of have to give up and go along with it and forget about, okay, I'm not necessarily looking at the well-made story that's going to have the clear beginning, middle, and end. Aristotle's three unities, we can throw those out the window type of thing, and just enjoy this recollection that she has of life here. The ellipses is another thing where her train of thought kind of, it trails off. So even in the original, there were moments where she's saying something, and then it stops. In some cases, incomplete, and it's that trailing off in thought. And we kind of do that ourselves, right? In conversation, we think of something, and we're probably thinking it's going to be wonderfully profound, and then it's not, and then we kind of stop mid sentence and just let it hang there. And I think that's again her experience of living in this area. So it was, yeah, I guess you have to kind of submit to it and just enjoy. And that's the experience I got out of it. It was a lot of fun, definitely.
I think you're calling me there to actually want more ellipses. I think I think there's something I like when I was actually reading them. I was like, like an ellipses makes me a bit uncomfortable. But actually, I think that's exactly the point, that like I so rarely encounter ellipses in my reading, and maybe we should all want a few more ellipses.
Well, I'm going to say, and then just let it dot dot dot, right? Let it trail off, kind of thing, and let it hang. I mean, Umberto Eco would talk about it in the sense of an open text, right? And I think that Li Chuan's Distant Sunflower Fields is incredibly open, that it allows you to wander off in your own imagination. And that goes back to this idea of creative nonfiction that I've kind of called it. I think she's also inviting her readers to kind of imagine what this life would be like out there. And you can kind of fill in the picture, right? And that's the ellipses again, an invitation to kind of fill that picture in.
I certainly was imagining myself. I was like, oh, I mean, I don't fancy farming at the best of times, and I'm not sure this is. When you talk about structure and circularity, like, it is, to me, another element that ties in with the sense of it being a very importantly, it's a book written about sort of memory and how it feels to live, because a lot happens, certainly enough happens to have a plot, but somehow it also doesn't feel like this book has a plot. Like, it feels very plotless in the way that other books might very intentionally have been written to be plotless, but this one actually has loads happening. I don't know if that's something you agree with, or I feel like that maybe ties in with this idea of like it feeling a bit like you've just come onto, it's almost incomplete. You get this part of her life, and you get what she has chosen to share of this part of her life, but you don't know if you've gotten everything, and you certainly don't get all the detail about sort of pre and post the book.
Well, I mean, that's a good point, because in kind of doing more work on Li Chuan's writing, I guess in a sense, the element of intertextuality is very present in this book and in all of her other published materials, because so much is written about this area of her lived experience here. And so this is, if you were, an extended episode into this part of her life at this particular time, that is, of course, connected to what came before and what comes after. And there's a lot of those stories are then developed in some of her other work, like Winter Pastures, which was also translated and published earlier this year, and then in her other Chinese language works that have not yet been published. There's a continuation of this, and well, in some cases, I guess it's not so much a continuation, but it's telling the forestory of what's going on, of her being up here. And I think, yeah, the idea of not having a plot, I guess, in the sense that it's not fiction, so it isn't bound by this need to have a plot. And whilst we might like to think of our lives having an actual determined plot, they rarely do. And this is what she's telling. She's telling her life story, right? And that's why I really enjoy, like, she gives you the description of the landscape and her interactions with the people, her interactions with her mom and her grandma. But then every now and then she wanders out into the fields herself and just kind of thinks about stuff, right? She talks about the ancient river, the ancient sea that used to be there, and all of these types of, the reminiscence of the land and so on. And so it's just a person that's out there in this, you know, if you've for those of you who have a copy of the book, you've seen the pictures at the end of the book. I mean, this boundless landscape that kind of goes on for, as far as the eye can see, and it could I think, very much swallow you up if you were to allow it. And that's what you get in some of those vignettes of her being swallowed up by the land and just kind of wondering what it was like. And again, it doesn't have to have a plot, right? Because I mean, there are memories. She's just telling stories about being up in this area. And it's interesting you say that, you have fiction that's purposefully plotless, and then this one is simply written in this manner. And I think that gives it a unique vibrancy, if you will, that it's, you could probably think of it being in a pub and somebody telling you stories about these travels that I've had. And I didn't necessarily have any point or any objective in these travels. I was just simply out there and I saw these things. So I've been recently reading Gregory, is it, no, Graham Peck's Two Kinds of Time. It's an older book about his experiences in China during the war, so 1940 to about 45 or so. And he draws these little pictures in it as well. And it's just he has an idea of what he wants to do, but it was going to be like I think a couple of months or a 1 year journey, and it ends up being 4 or 5, and he's just being sucked into the story that's there and allowing that to be told. And I think Li Juan does something different. She allows the land itself to tell its story through her in a certain way. So it's not necessarily going to follow that clear structure that we would perhaps expect to have in a novel. But I find that really fascinating, and it was an interesting exercise to translate it, certainly.
The other thing I find fascinating, and I'm wondering how this was to translate, is that I picked it up expecting a story about your relationship with your mother, with your grandmother, to be a story a lot about your childhood. And actually, I was quite delighted that it really wasn't, and that actually we don't really get Juan as a child at all, really. Occasional references, but nothing. And actually I don't have an exhaustive memory, but I can't think of another book I've read that was similar, and similarly a memoir but focusing on those adult relationships. And as sort of like the translator being, like, this idea of the translator being the closest reader a text will probably ever have, like, what's your opinion on that? And
you're right. I mean, that relationship with adults, you often think of stories about parental relationships will be growing up and memories of mom and dad as they were growing up and how I learned from those experiences as a child. And yeah, there's none of that actually. And that was a surprise when I first picked up the book as well, that I was almost expecting to have childhood stories and memories of being out here. But I found it to be very refreshing, I guess, like you did as well, that it's the adult relationships that she's describing. I mean, one particular chapter where she talks about her mom trying to reach her on her mobile phone and trying to get reception, and just trying to have a conversation in that manner, and you know, it brings in, I guess, a not that child wanting to have a conversation with their mom and their mom doing whatever they can for their child, but as two adults interacting over, you know, digital mobile technology that doesn't work very well because of where they are and so on. And you know, then the experiences of her watching her mom out in the field and you know, stripping down naked or riding on her motorcycle and, you know, building her own path and stuff, that are, her mom is this very full-fleshed figure that's very real, that's very grounded. Because I guess when you have those other Bildungsroman, you get this idealization of the parent figure, or the negative image of the parent figure, depending on what story it is. And here it's, you have these very grounded, real characters. And I found that was really refreshing in engaging with this particular book. And I guess that in another way, it goes to what we've been saying. I guess if we were to think of a theme, that is that this book, I guess, subverts our expectations. So if we come to it as a reader, we always have, okay, well, this is going to be about this. It's interesting to have, and refreshing, I think, to have a book that actually subverts those in a very real way, and creates a very different reading experience. I actually, my mom has a copy of it too. And she read it and she thought the same thing, that this was not what she was expecting. And then it was, for her, it was a different experience as well, because of course she's reading the way I rendered Li Juan's words. So there's a different intimacy that she has with it as well, because, okay, my name is there as the translator of it. But it was, she thought it was this, not at all what she expected, but that she came away from reading it with a very kind of, I guess, not insight. Insight. I'm always, I'm fearful of that word, insight. I don't know what insight we glean into anything, but this idea of getting a picture of life up in this very remote area that humanized it in many ways, and you know, living in the hole that they build in the ground, and seeing the lived conditions and thinking that this is, you know, contemporaneous with the lives that we live here, and vignettes like that, I guess, were, that's the subversion of expectations that you really very much feel with it. And yeah, I like that. I like literature that challenges in a way. That's not just something that's read and then put on a bookshelf somewhere.
Yeah, yeah. And actually, like, it has, it's challenging in so many ways. I found it environmentally challenging. I found it sort of challenging in that I expected a book like this to be a nature book, and this isn't a nature book really, even though landscape plays such a big role. And when it I want to make sure that I do get a good question in about the translation, and like before, sort of, I know that that's something people here are interested in. What do you feel are the differences between Li Juan's book and your book? What do you think are sort of, you know, the things that are neither better nor worse, but had to change between the two?
That's a hard question. I find those are really always a challenging question. We always get those as translators. So what did you do that was different, or what changes did you make to it? Um, to be honest, I mean, I guess when I first started working on it, I probably worked through about half of it, and then had to go back and rework things, because as I was deeper into it, I felt that the voice that I was trying to convey wasn't really working. And that was a different perspective that I don't know if I would hope that I've captured Li Juan's perspective on this particular area of the world and her interactions as a Han Chinese person with a Kazakh minority up in this very kind of remote and well, very underdeveloped area, quite frankly, and her position. I mean, there's certainly in media today, this is the big issue, right? Of perspective of how we understand this part of the world and how it's being viewed in, say, your Euro-American media and how it's presented and so on. So there was an element of that in the back of my mind. And then I wanted to rework things a little bit in terms of trying to make this as much of a human perspective as possible. And I think that's what Li Juan does. But of course, I mean, I don't think she reads English. She speaks a little bit of it, but I don't think she can read it. So I can't glean or can't ask her, how does she think my version has veered, or if it's kind of remained filial to what she was trying to say. And I mean, this is a question in Chinese translation studies or Chinese translation theories. Yanfu, this late 1800s, early 1900s scholar figure, talks about Xindaya, this idea of Xin being fidelity to the original, Da being the comprehension or the expressiveness of it, and Ya being the elegance of the translation. And in Chinese circles, they've latched on to this idea of Xin as being the most important, that it has to be filial, or it has to be accurate, and it has to, this sense of fidelity to the original kind of overwhelms everything else, and that then dominates translation. So it's all about being very, very accurate. But the Chinese language doesn't read the same way as the English language does at all. And so I had to make changes there, in terms of repetition is much more accepted in Chinese than it would be in English. And we talked a little bit about circularity in similar sentences. That's a different level. I'm thinking here more on the sentence level, that those are things that I had to change because it doesn't necessarily work in English in that way. And if all of my target readers are English readers, then I have to be concerned about that. So that was another way, I guess, of trying to make adaptations to it. Because I mean, translation is not about equivalencies or anything like that, right? This came up in a previous talk. So I guess if that's a roundabout, non-committal kind of answer to that question.
Yeah. No, it was a very good one. It was very good. As we sort of like head towards discussing this now in our own little groups, I wondered sort of what your because I know, you know, for me, I actually think it was how deeply uncomfortable it made me on a sort of like environmental question. Like, the only way I can describe it is the same way I felt when I decided to stop eating meat, and I had this like feeling of like deep uncomfortability. But this time obviously about plants, and
Mhm.
actually I can't stop eating plants, and I, you know, I will eat sunflower seeds, but I'm so uncomfortable with how they are farmed and
Mhm.
what that looks like for the environment. So I was wondering what your sort of if there was anything that you really felt like you learned from this book or took away from it, or even from the process itself. Was there something you felt differently from when you started working on it to when you finished?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's interesting because I do myself a lot of research into environmental issues and how they're represented in literature and other cultural texts. And it does come up certainly in Li Juan's book. I mean, there's a story about her mom learning about agriculture and then kind of having this teacher telling her about how bad pesticides and other kind of synthetic fertilizers can be for the environment. And then when she has these recollections of lost lakes that were there, how the sand is kind of growing in and swallowing up everything. There is certainly an environmental consciousness that's present within distant sunflower fields, and I think, yeah, it I mean, I'm already kind of aware of a lot of these issues because, of course, I do the research into it and so on. But it was striking to see how that comes out in distant sunflower fields, and it's done in a sort of matter of fact way, that she's not necessarily coming down on one side or the other. She's simply relaying the information to you, and kind of letting you make the decision yourself. And I think that's also a very important kind of um, exercise, in the sense that far too often, on whatever side of the spectrum you end up falling on, there's a lot of proselytizing on either side, of trying to get you to get it and do this and do that and be activist and so on and so forth. And it kind of closes off any further type of discussion or debate about alternatives and different ways or different possibilities. And you don't want to begrudge her mom and them, who were out there trying to eke out this very kind of difficult existence on very inhospitable land. And we're here, in my bungalow here in Toronto, and saying, yeah, that's wrong what you're doing. There is an element of first world criticism, to use that phrase, even though I don't like the first world and all of that type of stuff, to use that sort of criticism, that we are in a privileged position already to actually make those claims. And I think that she just simply wants to put those things out there, and say, look, this is a lived reality. This is, and you may disagree with it, and you may think this is problematic, but we can't necessarily begrudge people simply trying to make a living. So I guess that was something I found very poignant about Just in Sunflower Fields. I don't know if that answers your question totally or not.
No, I think that is what was poignant about it, wasn't it? In a big way. In a big way. You could never ever blame them.
Yeah,
Really, it's you can see they can see the damage they're doing to the
yeah.
land.
Well, and that's the other thing, that there is an awareness on their own side, that they know that this is destructive, right? And I think that's another part of the argument that's not always acknowledged, is that there is perhaps more awareness amongst people that these are destructive behaviors and attitudes and approaches that we have. And yet there is a lack of alternatives for us. It's either this or we die,
Yeah.
right? And I think that's something that it complicates the picture, but I think it's a necessary complication, for us to think about in terms of environmental issues and how we approach these, and the aspect of what, like, people like Dixon call slow violence, right? In terms of how there is an aspect of slow violence to the land, that these activities are perpetuating a form of destruction that is a creeping destruction. But if it still comes down to this question of living or not living, well, unless we're all deep ecologists, and we want to go down to that road and start thinking about, dramatic reductions in human population, I mean, you know, it's a big question, right? Soylent Green is made of people, after all, right? to use,
If
to
anyone
use,
hasn't seen the obscure, well, not so obscure, old film called Soylent Green, it's would highly recommend it for the environmental message. Very much not for the sexism in it. You can just
yeah,
forward all of those bits, but still a good dystopian film if anyone wants to
yeah.
watch. So I'm going to pull you back up on that second half of the question, which is, for you, was there a difference between the first time you read it and then the last time you worked on it? Was there anything you think changed in how you were working, like, in it from then?
Yeah, a greater appreciation for that, the minute detail that Li Juan presents. That's something, because of course, when you read things for the first go round, you oftentimes, involuntarily scan over things that maybe are not as relevant to you personally. But then translating it, of course, I can't do that. And so in the process of translating, you develop this greater intimacy with the text, and a deeper kind of connection to it. and that was what I got out of it. This idea of the minute details of living in this particular area and the challenges that her whole family faces and so on. That's probably what I got most out of it. To pay attention to those minute details, and it's in in those cracks. That's where life really kind of lives the most.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are now going to go into our breakout rooms. So the breakout rooms will last for about 15 minutes. And I'm going to put some questions in the chat just now that if you want to refer to, you're very welcome to refer to them to like get the conversation started. But you also, in no way need to stay on these questions at all. So a pop-up is going to come up on your screen.
Sorry to interrupt. I just saw that Linda Jones is reading Make Room, the novel that Soylent Green is based on.
I didn't know that, Linda. I actually had no idea. Oh, that's so interesting. I will have to read that.
It's by Harry Harrison. Harry Harrison. Yeah.
Harry Harrison.
This is a brilliant conversation, by the way, may I add at this point. Not mine, I mean. I meant you and Christopher. Can you edit this recording?
Oh, thank you, Linda. It's always, when you do first anything, it's nice to have nice feedback. Thank you. I'm just adding my numbers. So I think you should get the invitation to the breakout room shortly.
I just opened the room. There's 3 rooms of 5.
Amazing. If there's any trouble, you can just click and come back to the main space as well. So we'll be here if you need to come back and ask any questions. You can also message in the chat to me or Daniel in the main space. So have a lovely discussion and see you all in 15 minutes.
I think people are just joining now, so.
No worries, Luz. Lovely to have you here for the first bit.
It's I think Luz. Right, Luz is gone. I think the first room is just Debbie and Max at the moment. Second room is Esther, Jamie, and Linda. Third room is Linda.
Yeah, I can see.
Okay, brilliant. I think there might be a couple of people that are in our room still.
Hi, everyone who's still here. If you'd like to join a breakout room, that's great. The invitation is, if you accidentally click off it, you can go down to the bottom and you should still be able to access it there. If you don't want to join one, that's absolutely fine. You're welcome to hang out in this space with us. We're just going to be having a little chat. So welcome to stay here whilst we do as well. Or if you've got any questions for either of us, you're also welcome to ask again. Sweet. There we go.
Ooh, that was really good.
Fab. I really enjoyed it.
Christopher, do you think Li Juan's writing is more like Sanwen rather than sort of like a literature?
It's closer, I would think.
I mean, I feel, rather than sort of like talking about story about her grandparents, rather than grandmother and her mother, I think it's more like Sanwen. I mean, she have this beautiful writing, really, really solid, sort of style of writing. But really, as you said earlier, it's not a story there. It's not sort of like any plot or anything. It's just keep writing what she saw, what, I think although she doesn't agree with, she doesn't like, people compare her with
San Mao.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the big
really,
comparison.
it is really close, And
well, I mean, I guess she perhaps doesn't like the comparison because there is probably greater similarity between the two styles.
Yes.
And that's why she doesn't want to have that comparison, insofar as that she wants to kind of strike out and have her own kind of particular style. I'll admit I haven't read much of San Mao.
I read fair amount of San Mao, and I mean San Mao again she is just floating, you know. Whenever she goes, she just sort of keep writing, you know, what she saw, you know. It's not like a diary of a trip, and not like a literature sort of like novel, but it's just she sometimes talk about sitting there and just talking, let her mind floating and writing what she thought, you know, what she, you know.
I find that there's not as much of a description of interiority that San Mao doesn't speak as into as great of detail or as in depth to the same level that Li Juan does. I find Li Juan kind of allows her pen, if she uses a pen, probably not, it's probably a keyboard somewhere, but that you know, that idea that you let your pen kind of go wherever you want it to take you, and this idea of describing the internal landscape of kind of her experience out there on this land. And when she talks, I mean, that little chapter about the lizard and stuff like that, how she finds, you know, this lizard, it doesn't move, that's there underneath the sun, and then how she kind of gets absorbed into that landscape as well. I don't find that San Mao has anything that's comparable to that. I find San Mao's is more descriptive. But again, I haven't really read a lot of it, so I don't know. And to be very honest, I probably wouldn't have read Li Juan if you hadn't. It's not something.
Very true.
Yeah, it's not something that kind of jumps out at you. Like,
That's right.
You know, you look at the title and it's like, okay, distant sunflower fields, 遥远的向日葵地, and you're kind of like, yeah, okay, like nature book, maybe talking about sunflowers, and Caitlin's nodding her head, right?
I am really surprised. You know, this is the first book of Li Juan I wrote. I read, and I mean, it's really surprised me. You know, before that, to be quite honest, I never know, because this was strongly recommended by the Chinese publisher. That is how I come across this book. And after that, I was so surprised a book like that can have so many followers, basically. I'm really, really surprised on that, because I thought, you know, I was hesitate a little bit, you know, from the very beginning. And I said, is this going to grab the readers? You know, is this going to work? But at the end, you know, it approves. Very well. Yeah.
I think it's this unique kind of story that, and I go back to what I said when this discussion with Caitlin, is that I find that she very much invites you in to experience this. And the fact that it overturns or subverts your expectations is also what functions as a kind of lure to hook you, because you're reading it and you're like, this, what's going on? This is not what I was expecting to happen. And then you kind of have to read the next one. And the chapters are short, so you can kind of, you know, have it next to your bed table, you know, and pick it up and read a little bit, read a couple of chapters, and then put it down. And then something kind of always drags you back in. And I think it's that subversion of expectations that works very well for it. Caitlin, go ahead.
I actually read it quite quickly, interestingly. Yeah, especially compared to, like, I don't think it has very much in common with other big nature books. But if you think about something like Robert Macfarlane, that takes me forever to read. Like one chapter, it's the slowest I probably read anything. You know, and actually there's a paciness to it.
Yeah. There is. Yeah, I admit, I mean, when I read the Chinese original, it didn't take me long to go through it at all. But I remember, like, some of the other comments that they really enjoyed it, that they could pick it up and put it down and pick it up and put it down, but they always kept picking it back up because there was something about it that kind of hooked them, that wanted to reel them in, that they had to kind of see where this was going. And you're right. I mean, nature books, nature novels and stuff, they can work on a certain level. But if they come across as too preachy, I find that they turn me off. And it's like, okay, good on you. And then you wouldn't, but this book is printed, right? That's paper right there. So, how many thousands of copies are printed? How many trees died for your book, right? Like, you kind of, I don't know, you have that feeling with the ones that come across as really preachy, and then other ones can be very overladen with science, and then that kind of discourages other readers unless you really want to get into that. And I like the fact that she puts this out there in that kind of these environmental kind of messages in this very matter-of-fact way, without judgment on either side. And that's what I enjoy about it. I've recently been I've been getting my students to look at Jiang Rong's Wolf Totem, which, of course, the novel is very much about ethnic identity and nationalism, but then you had Jean-Jacques Arnaud's French adaptation of it in film, which changed the main theme to be very much about nature and the environmental cost of development and so on and so forth. And you can see that it gets a little bit too preachy towards the end in the film, because it's, talking about what we need to do and all this, this is what we have to accomplish and stuff. And then in the back of your mind, you're wondering, like, okay, well, what was the cost of doing this production in this remote area? And what's your legacy of actually doing that out there? And you get on with this. I mean, that's like COP26. I mean, what a colossal failure and what an enormous cost.
And a failure before it even begun. Like, you knew it was going to be a failure months, if not years beforehand.
Yeah. So I don't know. It's strange that, and that's, I appreciate the Distant Sunflower Fields doesn't do that. And it's like, go ahead.
I actually really appreciate Li Juan herself. I actually think that despite her spending the whole time telling you how strong her mother is in a very particular way, and despite it always being like that, actually, like, you're like, I'm sorry, you are living through this, and you are, seemingly really managing it, and actually you seem to have had quite a lot of things happen in your life that are, pretty impressive, and you've obviously written this book and on top of it all,
I have this working theory that the audience for someone like Li Jian in mainland China is this. I'm not sure if everyone here's heard of Li Ziqi. She's like a Chinese YouTuber that does these kind of return to nature videos. That's got this very kind of ASMR calm aesthetic. And I get the feeling that this is the literary equivalent of that, where it's a little bit like it's a little bit like at least a salve for kind of burnt out millennials working in the cities. And
although I've got to say, Daniel, it made me happier to be in a city. I'm not sure. If anything, I felt this sort of this dread of actually having to have it, for me personally, and things I enjoy and find pleasurable, having to have
Yeah, she doesn't romanticize at all. And that's what I find a lot of environmental stories and stuff romanticize, going out to the bucolic countryside and looking at the beautiful trees and flowers and the birds. Oh, the bird song. Oh, how lovely it is. And then you realize, but you're saying that because you don't live in the mud, the dirt, the bad weather, the cold houses. You go out and visit it, and then you go back to your city that's warm, it's comfortable, it's got your air conditioning, it's got your heaters, whatever the case might be, and the fact you drive back and forth as well, probably, you know, in your SUV and all of these types of things. So that's, she doesn't, I don't think Li Juan romanticizes it at all. If anything, like Caitlin, like you said, right? Like, I'm glad I don't have to live in a hole in the ground, you know, type of thing.
Sure,
I
cool,
admire
I think.
the fortitude to do it. But for me, that's a big issue with environmental discourse in general, and that's that what I mentioned, this idea of first world environmentalism, that it's possible because we already have a certain affluence that we're able to look on nature as this kind of pleasant escape from the city, which is just wearing us down, and cement and concrete and all of these types of things. But it's like living out in the countryside is not, it doesn't work like that, right? Like, I mean, I remember, again, to use the story of my mom, she left home when she was 16, and they got indoor plumbing when she was 15. And when I go camping now with my kids, and my mom, when I was growing up, we never went camping. She was like, I lived that growing up. I don't want to do it for holiday, right? Like, I'm sorry. And she says the same thing now. I don't want to do that for holiday. I'm sorry. That's not what I want. And so I think that's very much, that says something about environmental movements in general. That, I mean, if you think of the parks movement, where environmentalism kind of started in the United States, well, yeah, it starts where? In the wealthiest country in the world, that actually had the ability to start spending lots of money to do that, to start putting park reserves and so on and so forth. Whereas when you think of other places that don't have that affluence, how do they do it? Right, when you've got other concerns.
Hello everyone who's just joining back now. Lovely to see you all again. We just were having a nice little chat about the environmental books and how sort of Li Juan fits or doesn't fit in with sort of the environmental canon, as it were. I was, first of all, if anyone would like to speak, you're very welcome. Pop your name, just say like a hello in the chat, and I'll give you a little introduction. So how do we find the group chats? Obviously, this is our first book club. So, you know, we are very open to feedback and tweaking it in any way at all. I hope you all had a lovely chat anyways. Does anyone want to be our first volunteer to speak tonight? Anyone?
Nikki, possibly?
We can't go to Nikki. We can't always force Nikki. Nikki Harmon, if anyone doesn't know, is also a Chinese writer.
I've unmuted myself, so I guess I'd better say something. Well, we had a really nice chat because I think 2 out of the 4 hadn't read the book, or 1 out of the 4 hadn't read it, and a couple had read most of it, and I had read all of it. So we talked about how she fitted into the local scenery in terms of the people, the population, her literary life. We all imagined we could ask her a question. And so I rudely asked her how she'd managed to avoid getting married and why. However, obviously she's many miles away and hopefully fast asleep on the other side of the world. So I have no answer to that. I mean, we just had a good discussion about her relationship with her fellow writers, many of whom are hundreds, not to say 1,000 miles away in Beijing, Shanghai, Guangdong, and with the local Kazakh people and how she related to them. And also we talked a bit about why she kind of plonked you in the middle of this relationship between her and her mother, and why she didn't talk about her childhood. And we speculated about the influence of Freud in the West. Maybe it was because we were so influenced by Freud that we expected that kind of analysis from someone talking about their mother. But in China, Freud is much less influential.
Do you know, I think it might be a bit of a gossipy book, not in a very like human way, because I had also that instinct to like want to know her personal thoughts on marriage, monogamy, and all that sort of thing. And obviously, like, it's, you know, that actually is like an impulse that comes from the tradition of marriage, monogamy, and sort of from those traditions themselves, which is the part of the problem. But like, I think there's something about the book that like does feel so like, yeah, you want to know everything, don't you? And you're not going to get at it. Yeah, thank you, Nikki. That sounds really interesting. I'm really glad you had a lovely chat.
Thank you so much.
I just want to say I think it's fascinating that Freud came up into it. Like, I think, and you're probably right on the ball. That's what we expect. It all goes back to some childhood trauma, right? Because that's what we're indoctrinated to think. Freud, you know, it's all childhood trauma somehow. But I guess maybe sometimes things are just a cigar. So who knows, right? But yeah, that's really neat.
So I think Nikki was in group 1, and then I think in group 2, or I know that Jamie was in a group with a couple of others. Does anyone from that group want to nominate themselves? Esther, you're looking keen. Shall I not make you? I won't make you, don't worry.
It's all right. We had a little chat. We spoke about sort of the role of animals in the book. Esther hadn't read sort of too far in, so I sort of trying not to spoil it. But we spoke about the dogs and how they were sort of almost treated as their own sort of almost like human members of the family. Sort of how they had their own sort of personality quirks and sort of habits that got on the human character's nerves, and sort of almost how in this sort of really isolated environment, you can sort of imagine how all the animals sort of would sort of become almost like, you know, like human family members. And like, obviously later on there's sort of talk about the rabbits and how they sort of have their own personalities, and the chickens have their own personalities. So that was something we quite like had a little chat about.
It totally blurs the lines, doesn't it? I think for Juan herself, like these are like the practical and the pet meet in a very blurred line way. Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah.
What did you all enjoy the book? Was there anyone here who didn't like? I'm very open. Like, I don't know if anyone has ever come to Boardless Book Club, which we are shamelessly modelling our format off as well. But you know, there have certainly been books there that I haven't enjoyed. You know, for a variety of reasons. So if anyone doesn't enjoy a book, like this is definitely always a space to talk about that as well, and to talk about things we like and don't like when we read. You know, we can all read for very wide variety of reasons. So, and then in the third group, is there anyone who wants to nominate to speak, or is there anyone who would like to add anything that hasn't been said yet?
Iris, possibly? Headphone, you're muted.
Oh, you're
Iris.
muted, sorry.
Iris, you're muted.
Hello.
Yes.
Oh, I made a confession already. I haven't read the book, but I think in our group 1, Mess is going to say something. Is it okay, Mess?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Right. So yeah. So basically, there were so the 3 of us in the group. A couple of us had sort of partially read it, sort of the first sort of about half of it, and then yeah. So so in terms of what we discussed, we were sort of talking about, first of all, the sort of perseverance and patience required when it comes to, like, in terms of how long it was taking her to farm the sunflowers, and how, you know, it would only take sort of one small thing for it all to sort of fall apart. And sort of so how there was a lot of patience required there, and then we sort of touched on what sort of really stood out for a couple of us in the group was sort of the personal relationships in the book, and how sort of it's very sort of brutally honest. It doesn't try and sort of sugarcoat anything when it comes to sort of the relationship with the grandmother, without wanting to sort of spoil it for people who haven't read it. When she goes to live with the daughter, and in the sort of latter stages of her life, of the grandmother's life, it's a very sort of difficult time for the grandmother, where she's sort of getting very old and becoming very dependent, essentially, on her granddaughter, and waiting for her to come home from work and stuff. And she sort of, when the dementia sort of sets in towards the end of that chapter, it's a very sort of, we were saying how, for anyone who sort of has had a grandparent or knows someone older who's experienced that, it really sort of resonates with the reader. So so those were a couple of things that really stood out to us when we were discussing it.
Yeah, we didn't even mention that, did we, Chris? Like, at all, and I completely agree. And I also thought, don't know what you think, Max, or Chris, or what do we think that, although that I don't want to be like, I am not blaming Li Juan for blaming herself, but I felt so like protective of her. I was like, no, you're doing the best you can in this situation. I really didn't want Li Juan to be angry at herself, and obviously, we all can be in those situations. I was wondering, it was an interesting element to the narrative to sort of be feeling those emotions she was feeling at the time.
Yeah, it's almost like she's sort of done this very noble thing of sort of taking on that level of responsibility, and she sort of almost doesn't want to accept that maybe it's too much for her almost, but it's a very difficult.
Yeah, and it's not, and it would be too much for everyone.
Yeah,
isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just carrying on from that, this may be a bit of a spoiler, I guess, if people haven't got that far into the book itself. But after she passes away, and then how the grandmother then is eulogized by the party as this revolutionary hero, as this person that they don't know, right? Like, Li Juan doesn't know this person, and who is this? Who are they eulogizing here? This is not my grandmother. I don't know who they're talking about, but they're talking about this hero in these hagiographic kind of terms, and that's another element of that disjuncture, that the experience that she's had with her grandma in the late stages of dementia and so on.
That chapter was actually reading a horror story. I felt like it was really, really difficult reading that, the idea of it being so taken out of your hands. That was horrible.
Off the top of my head, I believe that's the grandmother is the only character in the entire book that has a name assigned to her, I think. And that's the only time it's mentioned.
Yeah, out of the main characters.
Yeah.
I mean, there are other people that are named, right? They're the Kazakhs who have all these kind of cultural revolutionary names, right? Like, I'm Bomb this and kind of the Vanguard that, and so on and so forth. But you're right. I think she's the only one who actually has kind of like a name.
Was that something you were very careful to keep? Was that easy to translate in? Or was that something you had to be very conscious of watching?
Yeah, I mean, yes and no, I suppose. I mean, it was stark. I'm actually kind of revisiting this now in my in my own mind, thinking of that. So thanks, Max, actually for bringing it up, because it's another aspect of the story that you internalize it. And but you're right, it's a very the perseverance that's there, the poignancy of that kind of engagement that she had with her mom, and then the fact that she's really the only one with a normal name, I guess, if you want to call it that.
Has anyone read Winter Pastures? So Winter Pastures is another book you could also buy by Li Juan and translated by Jack Hargreaves and Lin Lin. Is that right, Daniel? Did I get that right?
Yang, I believe.
Yang,
yeah.
Oh, so sorry. So has anyone else read that and has any sort of like interlinking between or if no one has, I'll get Christopher to talk about the interlinkingness between the two works.
I read it.
What did you think? Yeah.
I actually prefer Sunflower Fields because I so liked the portrayal of the mother. But I also thought Winter Pasture was very interesting because she makes this conscious effort to embed herself in this community of Kazakhs who are overwintering in terribly harsh conditions, and she's clearly not, one of these mad hikers who actually wants to go and live in sub-zero conditions in a cave under the ground. She makes no bones about it. She doesn't like it, but she has decided to do it because she wants the experience. So it's fascinating from that point of view. And she's very personable, the way she gets on with the family that she lodges with and how she relates to all of them.
We were saying actually, like when it was just me, Christopher, Daniel and Ying in the room, we were talking about how actually she herself is so personal and so strong, and she spends so much time talking about how her mother is so strong and in these very particular ways. And yet, as you read it, you can't help but be like, I think Juan, maybe you have something about yourself too. And I was wondering if anybody agreed or disagreed with, I'm not quite sure where I come down on it, but I think this is Distant Sunflower Field is somewhat of a love letter to her mother, despite sort of love being very much not spoken of, the literal word. I don't think appears. Does it appear ever in the book? Or maybe, but not in, yeah, I don't think so. And so, but for me, it is a love letter to her mother in these ways, and almost like one that tries to be very honest about who she is, and maybe not sugarcoat it again, which seems to be Li Juan's slight specialty as well. Yeah, would people agree with that or disagree? What do you reckon, Lucy and Debbie? Thumbs up. Yeah, come on, Debbie.
I'm muting myself. Hi. I don't know if I've read enough of it yet to say whether I think it's a love letter, but I can see how it could be. Yes, I can see how it could be.
It's a bit of yeah.
Because sometimes it's actually more profound, isn't it? It's more to make it so it's not sugar coated. It's when you sugarcoat something, that's not the kind of book I want to read. I prefer things to be honest. So I think she is very honest, isn't she?
Agreed. How have you enjoyed where you've got up to so far?
Oh, I've really enjoyed it. Yeah. And I was saying in my group that, the impression you get of the landscape is amazing. It's just amazing. And the whole thing about growing things, because I grow vegetables, and so, to the experience, my experience is, if something fails with me, I can just get it from Tesco's. But I do kind of empathize with the pain of having something come and eat what you've grown from seed, you know. And the way, I mean, the way at the beginning where she has to plant the seeds for a 4th year to get, I mean, it's just incredible. And there's nothing she can do. Like, I could do something, I could put a cage over something or netting over something, but she can't do anything. She just has to wait and see if the gazelles, you know, come or not. So yeah, it's
Yeah, we were remarking on that in the sense that the photos that are included in the original and in the translation, there's not one photo of successfully growing sunflowers, right? All of the photos are just the hole in the ground and so on, and sand and things like that. It's like, where are the sunflowers? You know, none of them grew, right? I guess, where she doesn't have photos of them. Everybody's holding up their books now.
Daniel and I are in a competition because Daniel's got his lovely green screen on.
I'm fighting against my green screen.
Agreed. And is there anything anyone thinks we haven't touched on that they thought was really important? Maybe in a weird way, you know, something that also stands out is descriptions of your body, and like whether you're sort of how your body itself is feeling, and then how the bodies of the animals are feeling. And you get a lot of description of you know, how they physically are, as if that sort of like has, you know, I found that quite like a striking through line throughout, because, you know, it's actually something that is like makes it quite uncomfortable, like, isn't it, thinking about being dirty, and but then you just get used to it, and then it's your new normal and all that sort of thing. I thought that was interesting as well. Yeah, if anyone has anything else they'd like to say, pop your hand up, and we'll come to you. But thank you all so much for joining us for our first ever Chinese Literature Readers Club. We're really excited to have kicked this off, and thank you all so much. It's been lovely to see you all. Next month we will be reading Shadow of the Hunter. So I'm going to get Daniel to pop a link.
Certainly. Give me 1 second. Let me just grab that from here.
Shadow of the Hunter by Su Tong, and that is going to be on the 10th of December. So it's a little bit early, but it's kind of like was Christmassy. It's like not a full month, but that's what we're going for there. So I really hope you can all make it, because I think, you know, speak for me and Daniel and Ying here, that we would really like, you know, to build this as a community. And I think that a really important part of a book club is, you know, that friendship that you look, I'm speaking in general terms, not the specific ones. Juan would not like me, but, you know, building that community up, and it would be really lovely to see you all again.
Definitely. Thank you.
Oh,
bye. Take care.
Thank you all. Thank you all for joining us.
Daniel, do a quick. Also, Daniel wanted to plug Sinoist Book Club subscription.
Right.
Sinoist subscription. So there's a book club, and there's also a code to get 10% off your books. CLRC UK 10. I'll pop that in the chat as well.
It's one of the features that we're currently building into the current website, and it's not quite ready for prime time yet. We're still kind of sorting out a little bit of things about it, so you're getting a little bit of a sneak peek of it. But essentially, the idea is that you sign on a yearly basis, and you get books delivered to you on a bi-monthly basis as we publish them. And you're getting a little. We hired a lovely artist called Anna to kind of do these charming little illustrations for. It's not quite ready yet because we're still missing a couple, but we're really excited about this, and we really hope that you'll like it. So yeah, you get all sorts of benefits. For example, like a 20% off our store and advanced access to the next chapter and stuff like that. And yeah, we're really excited about it.
Excellent. Thank you.
Fab. That is all of it from tonight. Is that? Did I get anything, Daniel?
You're perfect. You've been.
I know. So thank you all so much for joining you, and I'm sure I'll see you all soon, hopefully on the 10th of December.
Excellent.
Thanks for coming. Thanks
Thank
for having
you.
me.
Bye.
Thanks, Chris, as well, for a lovely, lovely chat earlier. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.